Thank you very much, Jane. It's, I think, a really important conference. I'm delighted to have been invited to be part of it, and I look forward to hearing some of the outcomes. Elsie, it's a hard act to follow. I can't promise to take people on a guided tour of Hong Kong, but I do hope that at the end you'll have a slightly better understanding of where banking fits in, particularly to financial abuse. As we know, elder abuse is real, it is prevalent, and we know that it is growing. Approximately 25% of our population is over 65, and as our population grows and ages and people live longer, we will have more and more Australians who are experiencing this phenomena. Financial abuse is billed as the most common type of elder abuse. It can range from pressuring someone for money to breaking the law. It often involves forgery, fraud, and in some cases very large sums of money that leave its victims destitute. It has sometimes been referred to as inheritance impatience, which I think is a kind of disgusting term, but it, I think, does convey the sense of entitlement that those who are abusing an older person financially, particularly if it's a family member, they see this as somehow their money, it will come to them eventually, and they'd just like to be using it now because they have a need for it now. And it's that sense of entitlement that is at the heart of so much of the family perpetration, and the sense of trust that the victim, or the trust that victims have in those perpetrators as long-term loved and trusted family members, that is then abused and taken advantage of. I'm in a room full of people who know a lot about financial abuse, and I think probably what's more constructive is for us to talk about responsibility for putting an end to this behaviour. The banking industry is very alert to the realities of financial abuse. Bank staff and the staff of other financial institutions are often at the front line. They are the ones who are most likely to be the first to identify an unusual series of transactions or withdrawals that require further questioning. It is those staff, whether they are on the front line and as a teller in a bank, or sometimes they're people who are seeing or having access to some of the online transactions that people are making. What we know is that it is an extremely complex business. This is not as straightforward as some of the other issues of fraud that banks regularly deal with. When you involve family members and trusted family friends, you're talking about a financial crime that's happening in the context of a very closely knit emotional relationship of long-term trust. The breach of trust is most often by a family member. And banks see that all the time, but they also have an obligation to treat their customers with respect and with dignity. And it's finding that balance between respecting the dignity, the independence and responsibility of one of your customers with perhaps wanting to ask them some very hard questions that would imply, even in the question, that they have perhaps been taken advantage of. That is very difficult on the front line. Technology is something that's in many ways bringing all of us closer together. It particularly provides ways out of isolation for older people. But as more and more technology is used in banking, it has some pitfalls in this part of the business. It means for many people there is no longer a need to visit a branch. And that means that often people who might have otherwise picked up a change in your circumstances are less likely to do so if you're simply not seeing that human face. It means with an increased use of online banking tools that there are an increasing number of frauds and scams that people can be exposed to, and it can be easier for family members. It's as simple as asking grandma for her PIN number when you're helping her to do online banking. It's not, there are some really difficult areas of exposure. And as we move to instant payment between banks, we will no longer see a 3-day wait between the transfers of money from one account to another where it's to a different bank. The new payments platform that launched last week is now gradually ramping up. For 4 out of 5 customers by the end of this year, all transfers out of bank accounts will happen instantaneously. And that doesn't mean that nothing can be done, but it makes it a bit harder when banks don't have those 3 days to pull money back when it's been sent somewhere that it shouldn't have been sent. So what are some of the things that banks are doing? Banks have an industry guideline that is currently in the process of being rewritten. There are a number of people representing organisations in this room who are part of that process, and I thank you for the work that you're doing to help banks get this right. This guideline has been an important part of that first line defence, but it's important to keep it current, and there's lots of work being done to not only keep it current but also toughen it up. Staff training has been an increasingly important part of providing protection. As you'll appreciate, bank staff and those out there in branches who are the front line have endless levels of rules and regulations that they have to comply with, but it's important, it is as important that training on this area is given to people. It's, as I said, often much more emotional and complex than simply complying with a regulation. Banks have been trying to provide as many tools and support to customers as they can to protect them. Banks, with a customer's consent, for example, can put in place arrangements that can help them to manage their interests better without exposing them to unacceptable financial risks. So things such as co-signatory accounts or two-to-sign arrangements, other things like putting a limit on transactions. Each bank has its own suite of options, but increasingly there are both online and face-to-face tools that customers, regardless of age, can put in place to keep their money a bit safer. Banks also rely, in many cases, on legal instruments, things such as powers of attorney, which, as we know, vary from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and the complexity of that make it even more difficult for those frontline staff to find the right protections and to act in accordance with those legal instruments. One of the areas where banks have been, I think you all know that banks have been having a bit of a reputation problem in the last few years, and you know, if you've been following media on banks, you'll know that there's a lot of work to be done to improve the relationship and the trust that Australian bank customers and the broader public have in banks. There's more work to be done, but there is also a lot of work happening right now. Very briefly, I wanted to alert you to the new Code of Banking Practice. This code, unlike many industry codes, is a legally enforceable code. For those banks that sign up to it, and they're the majority of Australian banks, the provisions of the code form a part of your contract with a bank when you accept one of their products. It is a code that's been in place since 1992, but it had lots of changes, but it hadn't had a complete root and branch overhaul. And there are some important new protections for customers. But in this space of financial abuse, one of the important ones is a 3-day cooling off period for guarantors of loans. Being asked to become a guarantor for a younger family member is an area of very high potential for financial abuse, and just requiring a person telling them that this is a serious thing they're about to enter into and require a 3-day cooling off period is an added protection that I think it's important to people to know about. It sounds very simple, but the code has actually also been completely rewritten in as close to plain English as a document like this can get. It has been writing in plain English sounds like such a simple thing, but of course these are legal rights that have been given to customers, and once you get a lot of lawyers involved, it can get very complex. We've actually employed plain English experts who knew there were such things, but apparently there are, and we could all, I think, see them used much more broadly in a lot of other areas. But it is now a much easier code to read. The code has also been submitted to ASIC for approval. If it is approved, and we're waiting, it'll take them some time to consider it, but if it is approved, it will be the first industry code of practice to be approved by ASIC, which I think is an important first step in the whole finance industry to ensure that codes of practice meet the high standards that you would expect of them. I always think in these sorts of forums, we need to be thinking about what the actions are out of them. Obviously, we need to come out of these sort of sessions with a better understanding, but if we can have things that are concrete and practical that we can do, then that's great. So, but some of the challenges for bank staff is that it's not always clear if there is an appropriate body to report suspected cases of financial abuse to. Our bank staff are generally not equipped in their own experience and training and qualifications to assess a customer's competency. And I wanted to just share a couple of case studies with you. So, and these are all real case studies out of Australian banks in very recent months. So first case study, an elderly customer living in a nursing home appointed a family friend as their attorney. Following multiple withdrawals on the customer's account, the bank contacted the customer to confirm that he was happy for the attorney to continue to access his accounts. The customer confirmed that he knew about the transactions and was happy with the current arrangement. The bank reviewed the power of attorney, which appeared to have been executed correctly. The bank enhanced monitoring of the account while permitting the attorney to act in accordance with that power of attorney. The bank reiterated its concerns to the customer a number of times. Some of the transactions that were being made on the account indicated that these were for things, for purchases and for travel that would simply not be possible for a customer in a nursing home to be utilising. They a number of times recommended to the customer that he seek legal advice or report the matter to the police if the attorney was not acting in his interests. During this period, the attorney continued to withdraw funds and attempted to apply for lending in the customer's name. The customer finally reported the matter to the police via a friend on the grounds of potential fraud and then revoked the power of attorney. The bank subsequently noted the change of circumstances and assisted the police with their inquiries. Of course, banks, once police are involved, have extensive evidence in their transactional records that can amount to a successful prosecution. The challenge for the bank in that scenario was to encourage the customer to seek further advice. Despite the bank's continued concerns, they were legally required to keep complying with the power of attorney documentation. In a second case, the bank identified that the adult son of an elderly customer had spent $900,000 from his mother's account on renovations and $220,000 on gambling. The son was acting on her accounts as an attorney under an enduring power of attorney. The bank contacted the Office of the Public Advocate, who advised that unless there was some evidence that the customer had diminished or impaired capacity, then the Public Advocate was unable to consider the matter. The bank was not able to comment on the mother's capacity, as she had not attended the branch for over 12 months, and bank staff are simply not equipped to make medical judgments. In this instance, it should have been possible to refer the matter to a statutory body to intervene or review. Banks will, where it's possible, take matters to the police, but of course the police cannot very hard for them to investigate a matter unless they themselves have received a complaint from the victim and the victim is prepared to provide evidence. That's just two examples, and there are endless examples of similar. So today I would like to, on behalf of the member banks of the Banking Association, indicate that we actively support the recommendations of the Australian Law Reform Commission generally, and particularly the three that we believe would go to providing significant assistance to bank staff who identify these sorts of issues. Firstly, the need to canvass and explore the idea of a designated body, a designated reporting body to which bank staff and financial institution staff could report suspected financial abuse, even where the customer doesn't want to make a complaint to the police. 2, nationally consistent power of attorney rules, and 3, a national register of powers of attorney. When I've talked about this in the last couple of days, people roll their eyes when I talk about nationally consistent powers of attorney laws, saying that will never happen between state and Commonwealth governments. I'm an optimist on these things. COAG has actually been a very useful vehicle for nationally uniform laws in lots of areas of activity, nationally uniform road rules, uniform laws about recognising our domestic violence protection orders across state boundaries. These things have been done, they can be done, they should be done, and this area of activity is one where we should apply our best endeavours across political divide and across state and territories and make it happen.